So what is data? Data. We talk about internal data and external data. And the internal part is something that we find inside the organization. And I will get back with examples, etc. So this is just a way to organize data. It simply means how do we look upon data? And external data, those data we find outside the organization. That's simply why we call them external to the organization. And then we have another way of looking at data. We can have what we call primary data and secondary data. Now, primary data, those are data that is collected for a specific research purpose. For example, when we collect data on the average height of VCM students, these data are collected primarily for a specific purpose on VCM students. So that is one example. And secondary data, that is data that's collected for another purpose. And it can mean that somebody else, a statistical bureau, the Danish Statistical Bureau or Eurostat or somebody else has already collected a lot of data, but they have collected it for their purpose, which means that it becomes collected for another purpose than ours. It also means that if we can find data that is collected for a purpose that looks a lot like the purpose we have, then we might actually get access to those data much cheaper than collecting them ourselves, because it does take a lot of time collecting data. So always start by looking out for data collected by other people or other organizations, because they might have collected data that we can use. And also always start at the library, because the library might have tons of data that can help you in your projects when you are looking into understanding a specific problem. So one example is average gross domestic product in DK, for example. Those data are automatically collected by the statistical bureaus. But these are the two ways of seeing data. So we have internal data, data we find inside our organization, and then we have external data found outside, and we have primary data on the other axis here. We have this on the vertical axis, and then we have the secondary data. Now, it's very important to kind of differentiate between those types of data. First of all, because external data might be easy to access and easy to get hold of, and therefore also cheaper to get hold of, because it takes a lot of time when we have to collect data ourselves. So that's one thing. And another thing is this idea about primary and secondary, because whenever we talk about primary data, that's collected for a specific purpose. Okay, examples. Inside the organization and primary data. If we want to understand our organization, saying how are people feeling in our organization, just like that, then we are focusing at our organization. It's inside, it's data that we find inside our organization, therefore it's internal data. And when it's about how people feel about our organization, it's a primary data, and it's something that we are collecting with this specific purpose to find out how do people feel about our organization. If that is the case, then we find it here. And it probably means we're going to do a survey, or we are going to interview people, we're going to do focus group interviews or something else, but we have to spend time on it. Then if we want to understand something about our employees' motivation, that would also be examples of primary data that are internal. If we want to map, for example, figuring out how are things, value stream mapping, for example, then that's also primary data internal in the organization. We may be so lucky that somebody else has actually done some mapping before, so we might be able to get hold of that, or they might have been creating some other kinds of data that we can use in mapping the organization. So if we jump down to secondary data, means data that is not collected for our purpose, but they're still internal, there we might find lots of data from our accountings, and simply means what kind of accounts do we have in our company? What do the numbers tell us about? And then we might have lots of data from the production department. They may not have collected data about how much they produce, what is the quality, etc., but they might have the data. So therefore, we need to start asking in the production about what kind of data do you have, and then we can take it and use it for our purpose. We may also find lots of data about inventory and, of course, lots of other things. So we do find a lot of data inside, and we always start by looking at these data that we have here. What kind of data do we find inside that is already created? And then we might want to go for checking out and investigating something more specific about data that is for our purpose if we want to map something specifically. Okay, let's take a look at the external data. Customer surveys. Obvious things to do is that if we want to understand something about customer satisfaction, we might want to connect that with our own lead time. So we might do some customer surveys, asking customers, how satisfied are you with, or what are your expectations to lead time? What are your expectations to? So there might be lots of different surveys we can do, but we have to collect them outside, and we may have to collect them for our research purpose. Means they become primary data because we want to understand customer satisfaction. Same thing with competitor surveys. We may investigate our competitors, and of course we probably can't just call the competitors and ask them, well, what are you doing regarding this and this? But we might ask our customers questions about competitors, saying, okay, compared to this and this competitor, how would you rate our service in this context? And then the customers will provide us with information about how competitors are doing, but they are still external to the organization. We are collecting it for our specific purpose. We can do supplier surveys, same thing, same argument. We have to ask, we have to investigate in order to figure out what kind of information do they have, how satisfied are they with us. We could also check out something about their strategies and how they would like to do things. Yeah. Then the last quadrant down here, also again external. Remember over here, always start with here secondary data, internal. Also look into external data on the external part, visit the library, look for industry reports, maybe get hold of profit and loss statements from competitors or customers. Also quite interesting to see, are the customers well? Do they make a profit? And then of course visit, as I mentioned, statistical bureaus, libraries, etc. Now, these quadrants, this is a way to structure data, and it's important that you remember where data come from. because if they are external and secondary, then make sure that you check up on the sources. How has these investigations been done? Are they quantitative, qualitative? What kind of object did they investigate, etc., to make sure that you understand the results they come up with in the correct way. The same goes with in here, secondary data, internal. Make sure you understand how data has been collected, who collected them, in what way were they collected. So basically, make sure you're critical to the way data has been collected. And also, of course, when we look at the quadrants, we can find both qualitative and quantitative data in all of these quadrants. So there's no differentiation between that part. Yeah. So that leads us to some different types of projects or research questions where we would like to understand different types. And the first one, descriptive. And I don't know if you have heard your supervisor say this, but normally we would say that a project at VCM, if it is only descriptive, then it will never really get a high grade, because describing something is not a main competence. It's a competence that we must have, but it's not a competence that will lead us to the high grades in projects, because the ability to describe something is merely the foundation to stand upon when we are going to do our analysis and figuring out how can we use this in a recommendation to a company. So description, lots of descriptions takes place, and we must have descriptions of how does the production look like, what is blah, blah, blah. So there are lots of things we need to describe, but we need more than that in our projects. For example, it could be that we need to explore something. Here as an example, how has the corporate rebranding strategy affected consumer attitudes? Could be one thing we would like to explore. Or how has the introduction of lunch had an effect on employee satisfaction? Could be another thing that we would like to explore. Or how has the implementation of, it could be lean, how has that affected employee satisfaction? Or how has the implementation of lean affected customer satisfaction? So this invites for more analysis and more reflection and more in-depth with the specific situation and the project that you're doing. Then explanatory is more about here questions may ask customers what they think about a new product and why they like or dislike it. Could be how employees think about lean and why they like or dislike it. So that is more like explanatory. And we also have what we call evaluative projects or research questions. So for example, to what extent was the marketing campaign effective and why? Or to stay in the lean example, to what extent has the implementation of lean been effective and why? So there are differences in these projects here and these different types. So a project being descriptive, yeah, it's fun, but we always use descriptions in our projects, but it's more interesting to figure out, besides being a descriptive project, is it then exploratory? Is it explanatory or evaluative, or maybe some kind of combination of these?